Okay. Hello to everybody. Thank you. Welcome. I wanted to welcome you all to the IPA Journal Club today featuring Emily Kuriloff, Psy.D. I'm Jack Drescher. I am the moderator of the Journal Club. Next slide, please. Okay, this is my bio, which you probably all read somewhere or other. Our guest today is Emily Kuriloff, Psy.D. Next slide. Emily is a training and supervising analyst at the William Alanson White Institute in New York, where she served as the book review editor and an editorial board member of our institute flagship journal, Contemporary Psychoanalysis. Emily's scholarly writing includes the intersection between culture, politics, and psychoanalysis, and the relationship between action, reflection, body, and mind. Her book, which we will be discussing a chapter of today, Contemporary Psychoanalysis and the Legacy of the Third Reich, explores the ways in which the trauma of the Shoah transformed the development of psychoanalysis at its apex and beyond. And the book was a finalist for the Gradiva Award for Excellence in Psychoanalytic Writing, published by Routledge. Next slide. I will also say we have two guests today who, those of you who have read the chapter, Dr. Robert Prince and Dr. Evelyn Hartman were both interviewed in the chapter. They're going to be joining us today, kind of sort of perhaps participating in some of our Q&A. For everybody else, the goal of the Journal Club is to be interactive so that you, the readers, can speak directly with our authors. And this session is being recorded, and it will be available both on the IPA's website and the YouTube channel within a week or two, usually. If you do not wish to be recorded, please leave your camera off. But if you do not wish to be recorded, I may not call on you to ask a question of myself or the author. If you have questions or comments, put them in the Q&A section, because we are not using the chat function for this meeting. And you're going to be asked to stay muted for this event unless you're called upon to pose your question when I call on you in the Q&A section. And I think, when we call on you, please unmute yourself, turn on your video camera if it's not already turned on. And when I call on you, please identify yourself first and tell us where you're from. Also, please speak slowly and clearly, as not all people who are tuned in are native English speakers. And if you have not downloaded the papers yet, the link to do so, we will post that in the chat for you as well. Okay, so here we go. So, Emily, welcome.
So, yeah, now you can hear me, right?
Yes, we hear you. Hi, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Drescher.
Okay, tell us where you are today.
I'm actually in my home office today in Irvington, New York.
Okay, well, good. It's good to have you here. And let's just say hello to Evelyn as well. Hi, Evelyn.
Hi, very nice to be here.
Where are you, Evelyn?
I'm in New York. I am in Riverdale, New York, in my home office too.
Okay.
She always copies me.
Okay. And Bob Prince.
I thank you for inviting me today. I'm very, very pleased to see Emily after a long time, and Evelyn.
Great. Okay, so, to get things started, usually I wind up asking a question or two to start. But so the first question I was going to ask, as I reread this chapter many times, what was it that first led you to write this book in the first place?
I mean, thank you, Jack. Thank you for doing this also. It's wonderful. I think that I was always obsessed with the Holocaust, in part because my grandmother lost, her closest brother and sister-in-law who were in France. And it was like sort of the theme of her life in some way. And also as a Jewish kid growing up in New York. And, I think we write about what we don't understand. And I think that doing all the research was some attempt on my part to get a hold of what feels completely unintelligible, unbearable, et cetera, et cetera. And to make some sense, almost to like use my cerebral cortex to help my limbic system to cope with something that for most of my life I felt was unbearable, and disorganizing and terrifying. So that's, and also that, it's a story about Eastern Europe, which is where my family's come from. In part, it's a story about Eastern Europe. And so I recently visited Poland, which really vivified a lot of things for me. And maybe I should stop there.
No, you can just tell us about your
Okay.
visit to Poland.
Well, going to Poland was amazing in many ways. First of all, the Allies flattened Poland. So when you go there now, flattened Warsaw. So when you go there now, it's like, it feels to me like Disneyland, because they try to replicate some of the older architecture, and but everything's very pristine and obviously new. Some things are not new, but that's the general sense I had. A lot of rebuilding. If you look at any photos right after the war, you can see that it's mostly flattened. And so that was one thing. The other thing, so it gave me a sense of the profound destruction of World War II. The second thing it made me feel was that the Poles deserved it. The third thing it made me feel was that I was a terrible person for feeling that way. But my grandmother suffered so much with the non-Jewish Poles. They wouldn't allow her to go past the 6th grade, or any Jews in her town. And she was so hungry for education. She's a very smart woman. And look, I think that the Holocaust was the first thing in my life that, how can I put this, blew my mind, disorganized me, made me question every single thing that I thought was true. And the reason I found out about it was because of family members. So it wasn't just the concept of the Holocaust, it was also the connection, the intimate connection. And I think, you're right about what you don't understand. And also, I needed to get a hold of my terror and disappointment and pessimism and rage. So, that's the way I usually do it.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm going to invite Bob Bob and Evelyn have also formed some questions. We don't have any questions from the rest of our audience yet. So, Bob, do you have a question for Emily? You have to unmute yourself, Bob.
Yeah.
Can we hear you now? No, we still can't hear you.
You still can't hear me?
No, we
Now I
hear you
can hear
now.
Oh,
Now
okay,
I
good,
can hear you.
good. My relationship with Emily has evolved, and we went to Germany together to give papers some years ago. And what was I got into my interest in studying about the Holocaust and its psychological legacy for reasons very similar to Emily's. But I think what's wonderful about Emily is she was much more emotionally connected, and I think, much more intellectually oriented to it as a defense. But it was also to make sense of what could not be, what was so disorienting and destabilizing about understanding the world. So we were really on the same page with that, talking about how just knowledge of the Holocaust shaped some approach to the world and some attempt to understand it. And it was when I started back in 72, nobody wanted to know anything. And that included many Israelis, and that certainly included many psychoanalysts. So
Yeah.
I'll leave it to Evelyn to pick up.
Yeah, I'm so moved, like listening to both of you today. And I have to say that I think that this discussion about the impact of the Holocaust on us and on our becoming a psychoanalyst, on psychoanalysis, I feel like this discussion is an ongoing discussion, like it continues to develop over time. So Emily and I met, we were both in the same analytic class at the William Allenson White Institute. And we became very close and very dear and to each other. And I think that the fact that we shared a Holocaust history was very significant to our relationship. I have to say that for me, my beginning to put into words my Holocaust history, my own Holocaust story started in analytic training. First, our dream teacher, Paul Littman, asked us to talk about where we came from as far back as we could remember. This was the first time I had ever uttered out loud the words of my parents' hometowns, what my grandparents did. And I felt in that moment like I was for the first time, kind of becoming a granddaughter, because all my grandparents perished in the war. And that was that moment. It was just a moment. I was 36 years old. It was transformative. Then I worked with Alberta Gelita, who herself was a survivor of the Holocaust, a very renowned, she was my supervisor. She was a very renowned psychoanalyst. And she began to model for me how you could begin to put into words some of this trauma. So I feel like when Emily interviewed me for this book and asked me this question, how did the Holocaust contribute to your becoming a psychoanalyst? I feel like I was in part ready to speak this. And I felt like I was speaking things in detail, specifically for the first time, and I could go on and on. And I agree with what Bob was saying, that this was not spoken about. It wasn't really spoken about in our treatments, in the world at large. And at this point, like as of today, when I look back, at everything that I've been working on in my own life personally, it's unbelievable to me that I was looking at some of that not through the lens of the Holocaust, because it just is so thoroughly me, in my it's had such a big impact, and it continues today. I mean, I'm very moved even listening to Emily and Bob speak today about that, about how much a part of who they are it has always been, and how compelling it has been for us to be able to formulate that which was previously unformulated and unarticulated.
I wanted to add something, since we have three of your interviewees here today from this chapter that everybody hopefully has read. When you interviewed me, I was looking at the chapter again. It was 2010, and it was an interesting experience because I had I went to school in Italy, so one of my plans for my later years in life was to maybe move to Italy and retire there. And I would be eligible for an EU passport as a child of Polish nationals. But I had tried when my dad passed in 2003. I had sort of thought about doing it, but I really couldn't bring myself. I had gotten an application, but I had really couldn't do it. But your interview really opened things up, made me talk about things, the questions that you asked that I had not really put into words, mostly because it makes me cry. It makes me very painful. So in 2010, I found a lawyer in Warsaw. And, and in 2011, I got my Polish citizenship and a Polish passport. I still have not been to Poland, but I am going in September to a meeting in Krakow for the first time. And I've spoken with a psychiatrist in Warsaw who told me that he's from Lublin, not far from where my father's town was, who offered to take me to visit my father's town of Krystal. And, I found it very moving, the offer, so it's going to be very, emotional. It's an emotional thing. I'm going to ask you another question, Emily. Is that okay?
Mhm.
Okay, so this is my question. And I hope people give us some questions of their own. Oh, wait a minute. I think I did see a question in the chat there. Okay. So my question, you interviewed so many prominent figures in the field. I also believe you had to do a lot of traveling to do those interviews, since all the work on the book was done before the introduction of Zoom into most of our professional lives. What was it like of meeting and interviewing all those analysts? Because you interviewed a lot of people.
I mean, it was wonderful for so many reasons. It was wonderful to meet people working in different settings than myself, different cities, different cultures. It was wonderful meeting people who weren't interpersonal analysts necessarily, because we still basically speak the same language, and a psychoanalytic language, and it was incredibly moving because people who start off as really professional, as they should, and they are, articulate, erudite, invariably when they talk about this and when I talk about it with them, it becomes very close to your, kishkas and your soul. And invariably you develop a kind of connection that can almost be overwhelming, but is usually very rich and, makes you feel like less alone. Because one of the things about having been traumatized and going through, hell is that you feel very othered, you feel very different. And in fact, that's how they treated Holocaust survivors in the West. They pathologized them. They thought they were kind of ruined, which is, a way of not acknowledging what happened and feeling it. So yeah.
Okay, so there was a comment from someone who we both know, but she asked not to be called by name, saying she was surprised when you said that the Poles deserved it.
Oh, well,
Because
I
she
think
said,
that,
because no, but what she says, like Alberta's leader, she's a Pole, and she was taken aback. Could you explain it a little bit more?
well, I wasn't saying that I believe that fully. I mean, what I was saying was I felt that way because of what they did to my family. On the other hand, of course, I don't feel that way because there's another part of me that's self-reflexive, right? And there's another part of me that's a critical thinker. And there's another part of me that knows history and feels for the Poles who were very much oppressed as Europeans and, taken advantage of. I think that the part of me that feels angry and hurt and outraged by Polish participation in the Holocaust also was having its, day. And it wasn't just the Holocaust. My grandmother, who was raised in Václavic, which is a small town kind of near Warsaw that I visited recently, um, you know, I think that there was a feeling that the anti-Semitism was like bedrock. I don't know if this is true, but that was the message that I got from my grandmother, who was, not educated, but very smart and very deep thinking. That it was just sort of like, they used to say it was in the mother's milk. Now, of course, I was talking to people when I was in Poland proper, who were sophisticated, who were empathic. I was talking to psychoanalysts. They weren't all Jewish, like in America, because, Poland's different now. But, I think that one of the challenges, but also one of the riches of this, is that when you take on this topic, which for many of you and certainly for me is incredibly personal, but it's also political, it's also sociocultural, it's also astonishing to anyone who comes across the history. You're deeply affected. And most of the 20th century, after the Holocaust, nobody thought about it like that. Nobody talked about it like that. Because first of all, there were like academic, intellectual norms of how you write about things. And second of all, nobody could stand it. It was unbearable. It's still kind of unbearable, but it's more bearable, right? Right, Bob? I mean, um,
You know,
and what? Say,
I
Yeah,
just
Bob.
I just wanted to kind of respond to this point that one of the things about studying trauma and historical trauma is that as analysts, we know a great deal about conflict, though we also forget a great deal about human conflict. And we get exposed to the whole range of human heroism and human turpitude, the very worst and the best at every level, and our fantasies about it. So I think it's very hard to not go up and down the musical scale of feelings
yeah,
about everyone, Jews, non-Jews, survivors, people in camps, all the myths and ideas about what they did to survive.
yeah,
Um, it's such a huge exposure to human possibility that it can't have any common signification. And I think I know in my own work, the most distant reaction I've gotten has been from my peers in this country, literally from my peers. And I think the warmest reaction I've gotten is when I've spoken in Germany. Go figure.
that's
So,
interesting.
Bob, what do you mean by with a distant reaction? What do you mean by a distant reaction?
The the first time I gave a grand rounds at a hospital in New York, the very first question by the most senior psychiatrist in the audience was, "Gee, do you think the topic of the Holocaust is, quote, played, end quote?"
Is overplayed?
Yeah,
Played, that is
Oh,
done,
oh,
overdone.
I see. Overdone. I see.
it's
And
over.
this was in 1974, 75. So there was a direct message there. When I gave very after I did my doctoral dissertation, I presented it at another university at their weekly clinical symposia. And the chair of the department, a very prominent psychologist, asked me to justify my data and my conclusions.
Right.
Yeah, there was a lot of hostility,
Can
or at
I,
least distance. I'm sorry.
no, I'm sorry. Is it okay if I say something now?
Of course.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
It's
I
your
mean,
book.
yeah, but you're really brilliant about this stuff, and you speak about it so eloquently. Bob was one of the first people to ever write about this, which is, so poignant that psychoanalysis is the Jewish science, according to the Nazis, but it really is the Jewish science, and in a good way. And most of the psychoanalysts who were Jewish, and more so even earlier, when all this went on, never talked about it. Never, 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 never. And they developed this very elegant, intellectualized, scientificized theory that left trauma out. Trauma was like, trauma was gone forever. And, I noticed that when I was little because my grandmother behaved like a traumatized person. Very smart woman, very, deep thinking and very musical and talented. She just, she would cry. She's my only babysitter. She lived with us for a while, but even after she moved nearby, she would just start crying and go upstairs into the bedroom. And when I was very little, I really didn't get it, but I did want to take care of her, you know. And when I realized what it was, which was really when I was a teenager, it was heartbreaking. And it was in some ways devastating. But I think that I was the exception. Even then, I mean, I went to school in a part of Queens, New York, that was like, I thought the whole world was Jewish, because they were all Jewish. And I was in this gifted program. Of course they were Jewish. So, I really didn't understand how much hostility and aversion and terror people felt about this, because I lived in a world where people took it for granted and they weren't afraid to mention it. I mean, not necessarily in personal way, but it was like a metaphor. Like I remember once I bought this gray, one of the first times I was allowed to shop on my own at Bloomingdale's. Remember, you probably know about this, Evelyn, that they would let you, your parents would let you go there with their card. I bought a dress without my mother, and I came home and she didn't like it. And I said, "Why don't you like it?" She said, "It looks like something you'd wear in Auschwitz." And that was very powerful. And you know what? I looked at it and I said, yeah, it kind of does. It was gray, but more importantly, it was so affecting in such a deep way that I took it off and never wore it again. So I mean, in little ways, it was always coming up. It was never gone. It was it was like like the theme song or something of my life, especially because of my grandmother.
So I'm going to ask another question. Again, welcome questions from the audience or comments from the audience. So I've read your chapter many times, but each time I read it, it's as if I forgot what I already read.
Mm.
And I experience this as a dissociative phenomenon. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I get it completely. I mean, I'll tell you one thing. I went to the Psychoanalytic Society in Warsaw, which is very lovely. It's small, which is poignant because, before the war, it was much more vibrant, even though it wasn't as vibrant as in Germany. And, I expected people to be nice, and they were very nice. and very happy that I came. But one of the things that I felt was when I went in there in a lovely little, you know, it was on two floors of a nice house. I probably for the first time, I've always known what dissociation is. I mean, not always, but since grad school, I became so utterly dissociated that it was frightening to me. You know, I was like, I'm losing it. You know, I felt like an automaton. It wasn't bad for the people because I was very clear and very like competent, but I was gone. I was not there. And I was really disappointed by that because I wanted to be there and I wanted to meet these people. Some of them were Jewish, some of them were not. I especially wanted to meet people who were not because I was so grateful that they came, and everybody was very smart, which was nice. And it might be the first time in my life where I really understand the profundity of dissociation. You know, it almost felt like psychotic. Like I was like, who am I? You know, where am I? What am I doing? I don't feel anything. That kind of a thing.
Jack, can I add
Yes,
something?
go. Sure,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, the experience that, Jack, that you're describing of dissociation is maybe not completely unlike, I think what Emily was speaking before, that we have been, I think that, and this may be true of people whose families have experienced other forms of severe trauma.
Yeah.
But I think that, this example that Emily gave before, she said that the Holocaust was always talked about like in metaphors, or this example that she gave about her mother saying, you look like, that looks like something that somebody would wear in Auschwitz. So there was Emily, wearing this dress, and suddenly now she's wearing a dress that somebody could wear in Auschwitz. Suddenly she's somewhere in Auschwitz. And what is a child, like she must have been, if she was old enough to go to Bloomingdale's, maybe she was a young teenager or something. She was already aware of the Holocaust, of the enormity of it. What is a 13-year-old supposed to do with that comment? That kind of experience of being dressed like somebody who wears it. The only thing that one can do with that is to dissociate it. And I think that we, growing up with this trauma, constantly in our midst, in our everyday midst. I mean, the fact that, my parents could just live a regular life given what they went through, I think is a steady, daily, ongoing lesson in dissociation. I mean, how else could a survivor live? How else could a survivor rebuild a life, which they all did? So I think we learned this over and over again. And I think that these kind of metaphors that were coming our way, or generic interpretations. I mean, it used to be that, oh, if you're a child of Holocaust, this is why you're afraid, because your parents went through. Of course you're fearful because your parents must have been paranoid because of what, just these kind of blanket generic statements that never got into the specifics of what each of our individual specific experiences were like, which is what we do as psychoanalysts. So I really feel that the opening up of this subject, for me, starting with, Emily's interviewing me, I also went to Poland, and I feel like the opening up of this subject is really an example of what we do, of what we do as analysts. I mean, we really try to really understand, not just that this is a human being like any other human being, or a person who just went through a trauma like many other people of that particular trauma, but who is this person specifically, individually? What makes this person up? What are they made up of that's different? What are their specific histories like? And it was a very, very long time for us until we really kind of confronted all of that, and until we were confronting it with another person,
Right.
So
So thanks,
That's so
Evelyn.
well
We have,
said. So true.
We have a comment from Gabrielle Shelley. Could you unmute yourself and tell us where you're from?
Hi, Gabriella Shelley. I live in New York City. I'm in my home office and I'm a member of NIPSI. I'm a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. So I'm a bit of an extenuating circumstance. I'm also a child of survivors. I'm an extenuating circumstance for a number of reasons. So I don't know how generalizable my experiences have been and my vantage point. Few things. I'm younger than most children of survivors. I grew up in a immigrant survivor community in California, and I was the baby of everyone. And I was all the children of Holocaust survivors, I was their flower girl at all their weddings. My parents were both Auschwitz survivors. They spent years because of tuberculosis in sanatoria, and they how romantic met in 1951 when they ended up in the same tuberculosis rehabilitation center outside of Rome. They were charity cases. Both of them had lost everyone. My mother was an only child before the war, so she hadn't lost a sibling, but she lost her mother and everyone else. My mother was from Germany. My father was from Poland. It was a mixed marriage. My mother came from a very educated, assimilated German Jewish background. And my father was a chassid when he was young, from the Ger Hasidim. He went up to age 13. He went to Cheder until 1939 when the Germans invaded, never had any education beyond that. Whereas my mother went on to get 2 masters and a PhD at the age of 60 in human development with an emphasis in gerontology. So I had very unusual parents. In terms of growing up, knowing that there was anti-Semitism or that it was part of the fabric of the community on my father's side in Poland, he's from Lodz, or Łódź, as they say it in Polish. They had, there was usually on Saturday nights or Friday nights and Saturday nights, the Hasidim had their own voluntary guard operation where the strongest Jewish men would kind of walk around at night, and people took turns because the Polish people are going to go and drink because they've just gotten paid, and they're going to go and they're going to drink alcohol, and then they're going to go and beat up a number of Jews. And you anticipate this, and this is normal. My father was the youngest.
True. It's still true.
So my father was the youngest of 6, and one of his older brothers, he was the baby, and one of his older brothers was one of these guards, volunteer guards on Friday and Saturday nights in their neighborhood in Łódź. My mother, the ancient cathedral in her town in Germany, I've been back to Poland, I've been back to Germany. The church, the cathedral says, there's a plaque on it, and it says, this church was, in German, of course, this church was built in 1369, the year that the Jews poisoned our wells. It says it on the church in her hometown. Ironically, nonetheless, anti-Semitism came as a shock to my mother, and did not to my father, because in Poland they were used to this and they anticipated it. But my mother, born in 1924, until 1931, had a relatively great childhood in Germany, relatively. And she was, even though she was the only little Jewish girl in her town of about 6,000, she was invited, she hung out with other kids who were not Jewish. She was invited to their birthday parties. I have photographs that were kept by friends of the family. So I have pictures of my mom at these birthday parties where she's the only one with dark hair and dark eyes. Everybody else is blonde. And then 1931, she was cut off socially from everyone. Children stopped playing with her. My mother's town was extremely actually pro-Nazi. So in the first elections in 1931, they already voted for the Nazis. Not all of Germany. All of Germany didn't vote for the Nazis until 1933, but in my mother's town, it was 1931. She was cut off socially, even though she remained in school there until age 14 when she was kicked out. So very different So the anti-Semitism ironically came as a shock to my mother more than it did to my father, because she didn't grow up hearing about it or expecting it or whatever. Anyway, getting back to me and I also, please tell me if I go on too much, because there's a lot there. So I don't want to tell my whole life story.
Gabrielle, do you have any questions
I
or
have some
comments?
comments. Yeah.
Okay.
So, a few things. One, so my parents were both very traumatized people. My mother had me on her 41st birthday. They didn't think that she'd be able to get pregnant in the end. She didn't want to get pregnant earlier because she had tuberculosis. She was worried about a relapse. They had me at the last second, and that's why I was the baby of the community. So people are always surprised when they meet me. They think I'm a New Yorker. It's just because I'm very Jewish. You can grow up very Jewish in San Francisco, California, a very progressive place, and still grow up in an immigrant community and understand German and Yiddish and everything else. I did not dissociate, and my parents both had definitely PTSD, very different manifestations. My father, I think, also had ADHD, and my mother also was dysthymic to some extent, but whatever, complicated. So I did not dissociate. And when people ask me why I became a psychiatrist and why I became an analyst, there are several answers to that question. Of course, I was going to be a doctor because that was the safest thing to be in Auschwitz. They needed you. You were a doctor. You could be used. There was no doubt that I would ever not go to medical school in my family growing up with my parents, number one. Number two, psychiatry and psychoanalysis, because I did not dissociate with my parents growing up, and sometimes things were extremely bad, I had no siblings, and all the other children of survivors were much older than I was, so I was by myself, and I had no one to talk to, and I had no aunts and uncles, and I had no grandparents, and I had nothing. But I didn't invent psychoanalysis or Freud, but I kind of had to figure out why my parents could behave the way they behaved towards me, and do some things that were scary and upsetting. And I had to find a way to understand it. And it just was second nature to me. Well, I understand these are traumatized people. I understand what happened to my mother here. And because in my family, also, my parents talked about it all the time. And I find with children of survivors, I don't know about you guys, it's either feast or famine. Either everything is Holocaust, or it's hardly ever mentioned. So I came from everything was Holocaust. And I had a mother who was obsessed with the Shoah, and she wrote 5 books about Auschwitz. So I grew up in a super Holocaust family. That's number one. Number two, just one thing.
Go ahead.
My mother also had a tattoo, so it was very obvious visually. And someone asked me once, when did you learn that your parents were in concentration camp? And I said, when did I learn? I said, I don't remember ever not knowing. I can't remember a time I didn't know. I don't have that in my recollection. Last but not least, so there was a lot to deal with for me, and I had different ways of dealing with it than all of you. It's nice to have a community, though. I'm not used to that. So this is nice. When I got divorced from my first husband,
Shelley,
I'm kind of done. This is my last comment.
Gabrielle?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. We have a couple more people.
No, when I told my father, who was modern Orthodox after the war, he was no longer Hasidic, but he was Orthodox, my mother was not. I told him I was divorcing my husband, who he loved because he was the perfect Jewish boy. And I said, so I am going to get divorced from David. He said, "Nicht wird mehr," in Yiddish. He said, oh my God. He said, you're sending me back to Auschwitz. I'm done.
Okay.
That was my
thank
father's
you.
response to me.
Thank you.
FYI.
We
Pearl
have
Cats. Yeah.
Pearl Cats. Yeah. Pearl, why don't you turn
I
on
can
your camera?
I can
and-
unmute.
There you
Yeah,
go.
you're good. You're
Okay.
unmuted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I was born 9 months to the day after my father came to the US from Germany. He got the last boat over from Germany. My mother came a few months before and tried to get affidavits, and she was from Holland, and she was able to get finally 8 affidavits, each of whom would say they'd support him for 1/8. And then I was born 9 months afterwards. My first memories were of my mother getting letters and starting to cry and go upstairs. And I must have been 3 or 4 at that time, and somebody else was taken away. But I didn't know what it was about. But it must have been that people talked about the Holocaust when I was young, and I understood things, because I started having dreams about my conception of a concept of why can't I find the word, of people being killed in the concentration camp and the fires. But it was never talked about. And then my parents moved to a place in Baltimore where there were no Jews. They were very poor. And I grew up with the people in my neighborhood and in my school all through my youth and until I left school. They were from Appalachia, and they were from Germany and Holland, these people. And there was a sense of relentless anti-Semitism. I mean, memory is not good with this, but I was beaten up. It was just all through my schooling. So I'm actually an anthropologist by profession, although I was a research candidate in the Baltimore Washington Institute some years. I also want to say that I thought Emily's book was groundbreaking. It was profound. It touched a subject, and you were just so bold in interviewing these people and seeing them in the way that you did. It's only now in my old age that I'm much more aware almost constantly about this background. I don't know what I was going to say, but in my book that's coming out on August 6th called Everyday Rituals, the Liberating Power of Our Routines, I have several chapters on death, and I have some things on trauma, and it really looks, I think it was a way, Emily said, she was solving things, because we certainly didn't have very much rituals in our house. But what I'm talking about in the book is that when you do your mundane routines, you are free in your mind. You can think, you can feel, you can question the ritual. You can and so the freedom in your mind when you're doing mundane routines is, and I think if I think about it now, it's that part must be autobiographical, because what was going on in my life was really quite awful. And but I had all this freedom to read and to write poetry and such. Well, I didn't mention that three of my father's 4 sisters were murdered, and their children. So my father just lost everyone in his background.
Sure.
My mother's brother with 3 of their adolescent children were also killed. Just one other minor thing. I got onto My Heritage because I feel that I have no relatives. And through that, I see so many people, and it's the only reason I think I'm doing it, is so many people who share my DNA. And I think that's the only reason I'm doing this, because I'm not that interested in the many people who share parts of my DNA, but it's a feeling that they didn't destroy everything.
Hi, thank you, Pearl. We have a couple more comments. Benush Baraman, I may not be pronouncing your name correctly, and I know you came in late, so we're asking people to unmute themselves and tell us where they're from, and show your and turn on your camera if you wish to ask a question, make a comment.
Hello, how are you? Sorry,
Okay.
yes, yeah, let's move. I'm in here.
Hi.
Yes, I don't know. Hi, how are you? I'm from Iran, and I really appreciate you committing this conference. But sorry I'm late because I was at gym. Suddenly I remember that I really want to cooperate in this session. And after that, can you hear me?
No, not very well. Unfortunately, we can't.
I don't know what should I do.
Maybe you could try and find a better internet connection than where you are.
Yes, okay, I will try it a bit later.
Okay, thank you. And we'll let you in.
Thank you very
Okay.
much. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about
Okay.
that. Emily, there was a comment from someone who's already left the room. I guess, I don't know if you read it. This is I read her name is the Polish spelling of Katerina Shire. She goes, who said she was a Polish psychoanalyst trained in Germany. I'm very disturbed by the statement calling Poland Disneyland. I am in the group of the colleagues doing research using the scale of Dr. Yael Danieli measuring the transgenerational transition of trauma. Our research is not emotional and personal, but takes into account the whole complicity of the situation in the Second World War. 6 million Poles were killed, 3 million were Polish Jews, 2 million Poles were kidnapped to work as slaves in Germany. I'm so upset that I'm not ready to speak aloud and to show myself. Any thoughts
Right.
about it? Yeah.
I mean, that is not at all what I was trying to do. First of all, the reason I think it's Disneyland is that everything's rebuilt. It's not, you can't fully or really accurately get a sense of things because nothing there now resembles what it was. And mostly that made me very sad. Because I wanted, of course, to see, what it really was and what it looked like. It's not really available. I think it's available in some small towns, perhaps. But I think also Warsaw was so horribly bombed that you can't recreate it because there's nothing left. There's nothing to go on. There's nothing to restore. And that's why it felt to me like Disneyland, because Disneyland is like a replica of life. And yes, it is more, it's clean, it's modern, it's a thriving city. It just, for me, had no relation to what Poland was like for my grandmother and my aunts and uncles who were, living there as Jews.
Right.
I certainly didn't mean to say that anything disparaging.
Yeah. Well, hopefully she'll see this if she watches the video when it's up. Michael Feldman. Michael, why don't you unmute yourself, turn on your camera, introduce yourself to everybody.
Hi, can you see me and hear me?
Yes.
First, thank you both for setting up this program.
We know you, but you have to introduce yourself to everybody else.
I'm sorry.
I haven't seen you in a long
I'm Michael
time.
Feldman from New York, and I am a third generation descendant of child survivors, which is one thing, part of me, but a part of my identity that has come to me and come to be integrated, I think, relatively late or recently, similar to what others are describing, but has always been with me. But I didn't recognize it in ways that were detectable, but not recognizable to me. Because as others have experienced, at least I grew up in a home in the Midwest in Ohio, though I had a Brooklyn accent, where it wasn't discussed. And I'm not sure how much was even known by my parents, who would have told me, because they didn't know their grandparents. I did. it took me on, I didn't really put that together in a profound and connected way until probably 10 or 15 years ago when I began writing about this area as a psychoanalyst. So I think that the gaps, and I would agree with dissociations, are expectable. I dare say normal for those who have endured massive psychic trauma and their descendants. I think our field, I know this isn't a question, but I do have one. I think our field, as we know, and Emily has beautifully documented in this book, our field has suffered because of its own unspeakable history of trauma and victimization. And it will take, as beautiful and as well researched and written the book is, of course, it will take generations to absorb it, its findings. So I'm optimistic, but also kind of understanding that that process will take time. And unfortunately today, we see some evidence of that in that someone from a different grouping didn't feel comfortable and needed to leave the room, and I can understand that. I went to Poland in 1983, or 84, sorry, when I went to West Berlin. That's when it began for me, and it became something I took responsibility for. And here it comes.
The question.
My question is, because there isn't one identity. So often for people across groupings of survivors, there are at least dual identities, whether it's I'm writing about child survivors right now, who are both, by definition, many of them are survivors themselves, and also the child of survivors, and bear legacies of that experience without fully realizing. This is where my question is going. Whether it's generations of survivors and being in more than one, whether it's the dual identity of being German and Jewish versus Polish and Jewish, where does American fit in? And now which generation of psychoanalyst you are.
And the question?
Yes, I wrote it down. So my question is, in your experience with this, to what extent do you believe that dual identity, or even multiple identities, both suppresses an awareness and awakening to one's own personal history and family history and trauma, and to what extent does it deepen it?
You mean dual identity of being Jewish and from European roots versus being a Jew in New York who's post-Holocaust?
Well, it can expand across all identities, but in this case, being a descendant of, I guess actually, I'm not sure if you're second generation or third generation.
Second.
Okay.
So, Michael, what is the specific question? I'm just trying to understand the question.
Well, my question is about the topic or the concept of dual identities, and to what extent does it make this more difficult to understand, and to what extent does it deepen our understanding? But it depends on how one defines it and applies it.
Right. Well, if I might, Emily, interpersonal psychoanalysts believe in a concept called multiple self states. And in the concept of multiple self states, you can have multiple identities. And sometimes they are integrated with each other. In the work of Philip Bromberg, for example, who I know Emily adored, but in the work of Philip Bromberg, he didn't actually believe that complete integration would ever be possible. that the best that anybody can do is to have some type of relationship to one's particular self states, and that when an analysis is useful and helpful, you learn about as many of your self states as you possibly can and find a way to live with them all.
Yeah,
So
that's really well put. Did I interrupt you? You want to say more?
no, that's fine. Go ahead.
I think you really put it beautifully. And that's really the point, is that it's not about understanding or not understanding or feeling and not feeling. It's all about context. And the most important context is the quality of relatedness in the moment. That's, the quintessential interpersonal relational view. And I think it's, very useful.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Could I make one follow-up comment?
Yes, go ahead.
One way it manifested for me early on was because of my appearance. Don't know if I still am, but I was a fairly blonde kid. I have green eyes. I have this jaw. And in Poland, in this country, unless I'm at a synagogue or someplace Jewish identified, I'm not accustomed to being seen and sort of read as Jewish from a distance by others, which is really where identity matters most sometimes, how other people perceive you, and certainly during the Third Reich. When I went to Poland in 1984, the first time, I was struck that even under the conditions then, and it was still communist, I saw the similarity in appearance, and others did too. I didn't, I wasn't recognizable as Jewish there either, which gave me a certain freedom, I felt, because it was frightening. Who would do such a thing? Only a kid who was taking time off between college and medical school, who had a certain omnipotence that Anna Ornstein described, infantile omnipotence, to think he could just go and do that. But we're in a different place now where identity is front and center, including in Eastern Europe, where the Shoah took place, and how we can't change the past, of course, but how we think about it and how we talk about it and who we talk about it with.
Right. I was just gonna say that identity politics, of course, are, ubiquitous, international, across many different kinds of identities all around the world. I have another person, I see Benush came back in, and I don't know if she's able to join us and speak to us. Are you there? Could you turn on your camera? Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. I had one more question for you in my list of questions, Emily, if I might.
I'll let you. Yeah, I'll allow you.
Thank you. So getting back to the book, I think, first of all, let's say, I think what's interesting about the audience response today about the book is that it's touched upon many people's personal feelings. It's not just really a book about psychoanalysis. It's really a book about personal feelings. And in your book, you describe the mindset of analysts who are either young children affected directly by the Holocaust or the children of Holocaust survivors, that is us, as different from our more senior colleagues who experienced the Holocaust as adolescents or adults themselves. And you write of us, the younger group, with a generational distance seems to have permitted a different kind of dialogue, one in which the examination of tradition and the development of personal beliefs and responses are not viewed as a thing apart from our professional development. So my question is to you, why do you think that is so? Why is it different for us than it was for those who were perhaps more directly involved or at older ages?
Well, I think the first reason really has to do with the shift in intellectual and, professional emotional thinking, which is that I think it's now everything is in context. There's no such thing as truth with a capital T. And therefore, there's no such, there's no way to really understand this in the way that we fantasize we would or could. And that's also part of why it's not just that it's, you know, unspeakable, it's also that it's not one thing. And what it is so many things, all of which are fairly upsetting. You know, and the more you can think, the more you can feel and expand, the more upset you get. So I think the urge is to, you know, put it in a box so that you don't get overwhelmed, so that you don't have a panic attack, so you don't feel like life isn't worth living. I mean, I'm serious. If you really let yourself, that can absolutely be what happens. And I think it happened to me when I was about 11. And my grandmother was crying, as she often did, and I never knew why. So I just would make her tea. She loved tea. And I got to an age where I suddenly realized that she was overwhelmed with terrible feelings. That's why she was crying. She wasn't crying because, you know, she skinned her knee or, you know. And it was, you know, first of all, it was overwhelming to me. So, you know, I was equally overwhelmed. Wasn't so good by leading the blind. But I think that it did help me ultimately to understand, you know, that some things are unspeakable. And also that emotion can be overwhelming. And you have to manage that when you talk about this stuff.
So you're saying the older analysts didn't have anybody they could analyze this with?
I think the older analysts, many of the Jews, which, you know, it's the Jewish profession, couldn't get near it. You know, it was too close for them. It was too close for them. Even if they didn't have family in Europe, or they didn't, you know, they weren't directly affected by the Holocaust, even if they did, it was just too close. If you really get into it, you can imagine what's going on. You can feel it, you can smell it, you can sense it, you know, because it is so horrific, and it's also so total and profound, you know. So, I mean, that's you know, I get that way sometimes when I'm doing research. There's a
Right.
point where I just have to say, I can't read this. I can't think about this.
Mhm.
And yet we kind of have to try for two reasons. First, it deepens our understanding. But the second reason is it's because we're sort of not leaving them alone, the victims. You know, we're saying, whatever happened to you, we can stand it because we don't want you to be alone. We're part of each other.
Thank you. We're going to have to stop. We're coming up to the thing. I'm putting my email address in the chat because I see that Katerina came back to the meeting. Dr. Kuriloff did respond to your concerns, and that would be on the videotape, which you'll be able to see. But I think it might be helpful if you took my email address, jackdreschermd@gmail.com, and maybe you and Dr. Kuriloff could have a conversation about what you experienced as hurtful, because I don't think she meant to hurt your feelings by what she said. I think there was a miscommunication there. But Emily, thank you. Bob and Evelyn, thank you.
Thank you.
Any final word, Evelyn, before we have some closing slides for everybody before we go.
Just one. I mean, I think that what happened here today, I think, Jack, the frequency with which you had to kind of gently, nicely interrupt people, I think speaks to the experience that it was for us to be interviewed by Emily in this book, which was that we could, and maybe for the first time that this was opened up, go on and on and on and on about this. And I think what happened here amongst the people who participated was an example of that.
Yeah. Okay,
What a
thank you.
comment.
Okay, so Agustin, and thank you, Agustin, our technical person, for your help today. Could you put up our closing slides? Thank you. So I just wanted to let people know our next journal club will be after the summer on September 13th, 4 p.m. London time. Tarek El Aris, Dr. Tarek El Aris, who is the chair of Islamic Studies at Dartmouth University here in the United States, is going to, we're going to be discussing a chapter from his recent memoir about his experience of living in the Lebanese Civil War. We're going to be staying with trauma, but trauma in another part of the world. The memoir is called Water on Fire, a Memoir of War. Dr. El Aris is not an analyst himself, but has very deeply embedded in analytic thinking in his own way of working. So I think those of us who are analysts will find his perspective on his particular kind of trauma and the trauma of his family as well. And the next slide, just so people know, while we're in trauma, in December 13th, Dr. Dorothy Holmes, who is the chair of the American Psychoanalytic Association's Holmes Commission, will be talking about the Holmes report. The Holmes Commission's report is going to be published, coming out, I think, this month in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. So that paper will be available for reading, as part of the Journal Club in December. And thank you, everybody, for coming. It was I found I was very moved several times during the conversation by everybody's participation. And yes, I apologize if I was thank you, Evelyn, for saying my interrupting was polite, but that was my job as moderator. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Jack, for doing this and doing it with such sophistication, but also such authentic feeling. It's a
you.
wonderful combination, and
Right.
I'm really grateful to you.
Right. Glad you're all coming. Goodbye.
Thank you.
So applause, Dr. Kuriloff. Thank you.
Oh,
Okay.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.